So I've identified myself as an idea person when I look at my life and myself. And I ask, what value, what worth is there to anything in my life? Sometimes it seems utterly worthless. Certainly I seem utterly of no value to anything or anyone most of the time. Because I'm not a producer, and all I have to contribute most of the time is a bunch of ideas coming out of my head. And they say, well, this is what my parents used to say to me. I would talk to them about my ideas, and they would say, well, I don't see you doing anything about it. I could have fabulous ideas. I could have the idea of, going to another planet. Not that I did, but that's an example of thinking of an imaginative type of a thing. It's not imaginative now. When space travel is so prevalent throughout our society, it doesn't take a lot of imagination for kids. Some kid to say, I want to be an astronaut. That doesn't take any real originality for a kid to say, I want to be an astronaut, because they didn't think of it. But to say you want to be an astronaut in the 1500s, like Leonardo da Vinci, that's a different story. That's original thinking. Leonardo da Vinci wanted to be an astronaut. Yes, that was original thinking. But people in the 1900s or the 2000s saying, I want to be an astronaut, there's nothing original in that. They just buy that shit out of their television cartoons and their science fantasy entertainment. But there's nothing original in it. And those same people, most of them, you put them in a situation that requires original thinking, they won't come up with anything, but they'll sit there and say, I want to be an astronaut, because I'm a maverick. Yeah, sure. So, anyhow, that was just an example of I thought in the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, I never heard anyone talk about solar-powered automobiles. Never heard anybody. You barely heard anybody talk about solar energy at all, and when you did, it was only talking about warming up water. That's the extent of what they spoke about in the 1970s about solar energy. And then, even then, they said, well, solar power all it can do is warm up water a little bit, and that's about all it can ever do. All it can do and all it will ever be able to do. And it's just, that's just people, just the only people that are pursuing solar power are just crackpots. They're just a bunch of alchemist crackpots trying to imagine in their own fantasy imagination, trying to imagine something ridiculous that will never happen. That was the attitude towards solar power in the 1970s. And when I came up with the idea of, suppose we had a solar-powered automobile, what do you think the reaction to that was? The reaction was that you're a total fantasy kook. Once you get back to it. And so I would mention any kind of idea that I had, such as, for instance, solar-powered automobiles, and I would say, well, don't you think that's an interesting idea? And the reaction I would get, especially from my parents, would be, well, I don't see you doing anything about it. Well, maybe the people who do something about it, that's not the only type of personality and identity that there is in the world. It's not the only type of personality and identity that is needed in the world. We need people who are able to come up with the ideas and the concepts, not necessarily capable of putting together the mechanics of it, but capable of coming up with the idea in the first place that the mechanical-minded people can then apply their type of brain power, their type of how, their minds that look at everything and are constantly asking the question, how does it work? How can you put it together? And those are the people spend their lives being mechanics, and their minds are focused on primarily the question of how. My mind, an idea person, my mind was focused on the question of why. Why should we even be wasting our energy or devoting our energy to doing this thing or that thing, when you look at what the results of it, look at whether it actually does us any good. I would look at automobiles polluting the air, and I'd say, well, why should we even allow this to happen? This is when look at the results, look at the effects of having combustion engines. And then I would look at the idea of, suppose we had a solar-powered electrical engine. suppose we had a solar-powered engine, then I would say, why not? And the reaction that I would get from all the mechanical-minded how people would, I don't see you doing anything about it. So that's my point here, is that I think there's not only that there's a great validity and a great need in this world for idea people, for the people who ask why. No matter how many millions and billions of people who are not idea people, who do not ask why, but ask only how their whole lives, and say, well, I don't see you doing anything, but I don't. So if you're not doing something, then it's not valid. No matter how many of those people will say, oh, you're just a crackpot and you're just worthless because you don't produce anything. You know, the same thing was said to Mark Twain when he was in his 20s or 30 years old, and he had written to his brother about how he decided he wanted to be a writer. And his brother said, oh, you'll never be a writer. You're too lazy. You can never actually sit down and produce something on paper because you can't apply yourself. That's what Mark Twain's brother said to him. Mark Twain sat down and proved him wrong by becoming one of the most famous writers, American writers of all time. If not, in fact, the most famous, most well-known, most popular American writers of all time was Mark Twain. But his own brother gave him this condescending, discouraging feedback. He said, "Oh, you can never do that. You never be a writer. All you do is you're just full of ideas, but you don't actually produce anything." That's what it is. And my point is that to be a Mark Twain, you cannot be a Mark Twain if you aren't full of ideas. That's what distinguishes Mark Twain, was that he had ideas more than most of his contemporaries, and eventually when he got himself to put those ideas down, then people recognize him as one of the most creative thinkers of all time. But we don't honor people who are idea people. We don't honor until maybe, after they're dead or after they're famous. Then they say, "Oh, isn't he wonderful? Isn't he marvelous? Isn't he a genius?" But until you get to that point with the public validation of public sentiment, the same people, even though your own closest family members, will just put you down and say, "Oh, he'll never amount to anything." And so I think that when I see my mind working with churning out ideas, not only does it mean that I'm not utterly worthless, but there is a very real worth and need for that kind of thinking. There is a need for people who are primarily idea people, and a world that exists without people whose primary mode of being is that of ideas, in the world of ideas and in the playing of ideas against each other. That would be a world in which most things that we think of as worthwhile would never come into existence in the first place. Most of the inventions that you, including this computer, who do you think invented computers? You think the idea people weren't the primary motivation in the fact that the computers exist at all? This was the pioneers of computer technology. First had to think of the idea of the computer and imagine something that had never been and say, why not? Even though very often everyone around them, especially everyone in their family, would tell them, would you stop being a crazy dreamer? You'll never amount to anything. That's the way it is. That's the way it was with the people that invented the computer, as well as thousands and millions of other inventions that we take for granted and depend upon. These things came about because somebody somewhere was an idea person. Somebody had what was called crazy ideas that other people thought was just crazy talk and wouldn't amount to anything. And that's what I am. I don't want to apologize for being just an idea person and not a make it happen person, not a mechanical minded production person. I not only do not apologize for not being this way, I don't think there's any need. There's so many mechanical minded people that produce things that there's no need for somebody like me to waste his energy trying to be something that he's not, trying to force himself to be a producer when what he is a thinker and a producer of ideas, but not a producer of objects. Let those people who are mechanical minded producers of objects, let them do the production, but let the idea people give them the ideas to work on. And that's where I fit in. That's my talent, that's my strength, is I'm an idea person. I'm a kind of computer. You can throw ideas, put down ideas on a punch card and shove them into my head, and I'll churn over them for a few minutes, and then I'll spit out an idea that maybe you wouldn't have thought of, but I would, because I put things together, because that's the kind of person and mind that I have. And so there we go. That's what I want to say on that subject about being an idea person.